becoming more aware of your body and taking care of your body is an area of personal growth, really. And also, we've learned so much in science about the mind-body connection, right? And especially with some of the work in trauma, we've learned that you can heal some of the problems that you have starting from the body rather than necessarily arguing with yourself in your head. Anxiety is when you're comparing something. You're comparing what happened with what should have happened. You know, that was wrong. And so there's anxiety about that. And then when you're thinking about the future, and worrying is when you're doing a worst case scenario about what might happen, right? And nothing's happened yet, right? You're just imagining it. That's what worrying is. Now, I also say to people who worry a lot that that's a skill in the sense that you have a good imagination and you can start employing your imagination in a more positive way. But right now, what I'm saying is that when you're in the future and thinking about what's going to happen next, it's also quite possible to feel anxiety, right? So there's regret and there's worry. And so if you're in the present, you really don't have either of those. You can just be fully in the present. You may not be deliriously happy, but you can feel calm and content. So bringing yourself into the present is something that you can do anytime. And you can do it very quickly by doing the sensory recruitment. And so I did a little bit of that last night at the beginning of the meditation. And then we did a body scan. And there's a script for a body scan at the back of your packet. We're not going to necessarily go through it in detail, but you can have that if you want to use that for yourself. And one way of using it for yourself is to record it in your own voice. Just read it into your phone or whatever, and then listen to it. And you can listen to yourself calming yourself. Okay? Which goes back to the self-care and self-nurturing. And what Josh is talking about here is simply changing your focus from being outside and paying attention to your environment, which is what we're usually doing. We're usually scanning for threat, right? Because we're wired for survival. So we're always scanning, and we're usually externally focused. Exterioception, they call it. So focusing, this method that Josh is talking about, which is actually a little book called Focusing. It takes you into your body just to become really aware of what's going on in your body. It's a little different from the body scan because you're not going through all the muscles, but you're paying attention to what all the different sensations are. So all of these techniques related to relaxing your body have to do with your nervous system, basically. Because when you get anxious and, you're feeling like an animal on the plains of Africa, our evolution takes a long time, a long, long time. So a lot of what we do is still rooted in our evolutionary origins, and it makes sense, okay? And so understanding some of this and knowing that it makes sense can help you, first of all, not feel guilty that you're doing it because you're doing it for good reason. Fear is your basic bottom line emotion, and that's for good reason. And so when you feel threatened, your body goes into a fight or flight response. We'll talk about this more a bit later. But fight or flight or freeze, actually, there's three. But you're trying to take care of yourself in some way. And you're trying to take care of yourself immediately. And you need that. If you're out in the middle of the street and there's a bus coming and you see that you're about to die, you need to have that response so that you can run. You can get the hell out of there. Okay? But we're not always in life and death situations. In our modern life, we don't have the predators that are about to eat us all the time. So what we have to do is get better at threat assessment. Are you really in danger? Okay? And so the thing is that your body and brain don't always know what time it is. You know, sometimes you can have a feeling of threat, and that's what people often call a trigger. You know, you're feeling threatened, but actually you're not in danger. And what's happening is that your brain is getting confused about what time you're in, and it can take you back. You're having an emotional flashback. That's what a trigger is. So what we need to get better at is figuring out what to do in those situations, because we have to learn how to keep our frontal cortex online, because when your body is engaged in this threat response in the fight or flight mode, your sympathetic nervous system is jacked up, it's geared up to try and respond and take care of yourself. Okay, and it does that so immediately that it's hard to think, right? Haven't you had situations where you haven't been able to really be all that rational? Somebody says something to you that was not meant to be insulting or offensive at all, but it sounded a whole lot like your dad or something, you know, in your past. And so you react, you get really defensive, or you get angry, or something like that, where later you think, wow, what was that? And everybody's wondering, what was that? Well, what happened was you weren't in the present. You weren't really assessing accurately what was going on, and you were reacting because your memories are still with you. You have explicit memories, which are things that are clear to you, that you can remember, and you also have a narrative memory, which is the narration of what's going on in the present, but you also have implicit memory, which is the memory that you don't know you have. It's stored in there, but it's archived. It's archived mainly in your amygdala, which is that little part of your brain in the back that stores memory, and especially emotional memory. Because when you code something that's happening, you code it with emotion. You know, you notice how your strongest memories are memories of something where you felt emotional in some way. You were really happy or glad, or you were scared to death, or you were really angry. They're coded emotionally, and mostly in your amygdala. Whereas words and the narrative memory is coded more immediately in your hippocampus. So what we're trying to work with here is the implicit memory, and how that is coming into the present without you knowing it. It's subconscious, right? You don't know that this person is reminding you of your dad, right? You're just reacting. And sometimes you can get really self-justified about it, because you can make an argument for why your reaction was relevant to the present. But it's when there's an overreaction that's your big clue. When you've overreacted to something, that's your clue that you've got some implicit memory that's clouding the present. Is this making sense? Okay. So one of the huge areas of skill building is to get in better relationship with your body, because you can deal with your implicit memory, with your unconscious, with your with your history more easily by going straight to the nervous system and calming yourself, so that your prefrontal cortex can come online and you can actually think about it. You know, what does this remind me of? And then the second whole half of this, which we'll deal with mostly tomorrow, is how do I then respond? How can I be intentional about responding to situations? And how can I be intentional in my life in being who I really want to be, instead of this angry person who's still mad at my dad or whatever? How can I be in the present and be acting in ways that make me feel like I'm in integrity with myself, with my values and who I want to be now, instead of in the past? And I know that we've been taught that in the religious background that there is no sense of honor or integrity or morals outside of religion, right? So if you're going to leave your religion, then you have no moral compass. You have no set of values or morals to guide you. And that's simply not true. And we're going to get into that. So part of this skill set is also getting to know yourself to where you really respect yourself, and you have a code of honor. You have principles and values that you want to live by. There are ways in which you want to be as a person and as an active person in the world. And that's not a blank slate. That's not an empty hole. You're not without resources within you. So that's more of a focus on tomorrow. But I just wanted to tell you that we're covering these different areas of body awareness because that's a direction, a skill set that you can use anytime, all the time. That's yours. And it's great to practice these things when nothing's happening, when there is no threat, like we're doing this weekend, so that you know how to do it. Do a body scan every day. Do some focusing every day. Do sensory recruitment. I do sensory recruitment when I'm sitting in traffic. Instead of getting irritated, I can just bring myself into the present, and it's calming, and that's what we want. You want this homeostasis in your body between your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic, because they work together. One is energizing, one is calming, and you want them to work together so that you can function and so that your brain can function at full capacity, so that you can make decisions out of intention instead of reaction. Okay? So that's a little bit of an overview of what we're covering. And this is very relevant to trauma treatment these days because we've just learned so much about the mind-body connection, and knowing that the nervous system is doing all this stuff, and it's doing an awful lot without our knowing it. But we're catching on. We're finding out, and we're not going to let our nervous systems run the show. We're talking about what you're dealing with, because instead of just having vague feelings of, I went through a lot of shit when I was little, you have a better idea of what you've actually been through. Because with this approach, we're getting away from diagnosis. We're not saying that there's anything wrong with you. You're not diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or depression or bipolar or any of these illnesses where it's a pathological sort of thing, where there's something wrong with you. What we're talking about, and this is basically a PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome kind of approach, and RTS is a kind of PTSD, right? It's just religious trauma that we're talking about. It's not as if there haven't been any other traumas in your life, but religious trauma covers quite a lot because it covers so much of life, right? It affects who you think you are, who other people are. It affects your relationships. It affects what you think of history, of, Adam and Eve in the garden instead of evolution, your sense of reality, your sense of the future, your sense of the afterlife. It affects everything. Know what I'm saying? Right? So when that is that powerful, it bears a little examination. And actually a lot of therapists don't really realize how much it affects and the depth of how it affects you. So sometimes you have to educate them a little bit. Just give them my book for homework. No, people have done that. Or just the articles on the website. But seriously, it's a huge thing to comprehend. And what I've found in the 30 years I've been doing this is that the survivors themselves don't know clearly what they've actually experienced, right? Because there's been a certain amount of normalizing and gaslighting, like, oh, you went to church every Sunday and every Wednesday. That sounds okay to me, you know, to have somebody who didn't go through it, think that you haven't been through much, right? Or even somebody saying, get over it, you know, that was the past. Now is now, what's your problem? Like an adolescent growing up or finding out there's no Santa Claus and you just get over it, it's no big deal. And so we want to stop that sort of gaslighting and get more clear on comprehending what you've been through so that you can acknowledge it to yourself, to your inner child. Yes, you have gone through a lot, and what's happened is that you've developed coping skills. You did some things along the way to cope and survive, right? So there's nothing wrong with you. The problem is what's happened to you, what has happened in your life. And the things that you did then and the things that you do now are patterns of coping, right? So if you're if you run away and hide a lot from things, well, maybe that was a really great thing to do when you were young. Maybe it helped you survive. Maybe there was violence in the house or mental violence like this. And that was the best thing to do. So good for you. You know, that wasn't pathological at all. Or maybe you got very active about it and ran away, or got very angry, or cut yourself, or because you were taught that you're basically scum, right? You were taught you're a degraded person and you should punish yourself, and maybe God would be a little easier on you that way. So whatever you did and whatever your patterns are now are coping survival patterns. It's not because there's something basically wrong with you, and that's really important. It's very important to see yourself as essentially innocent and essentially trying to survive and trying to just live your life in a happy, healthy way, the way a child would, you know. And that's why we use the inner child metaphor, because a child doesn't know that they should feel bad about themselves, or that life should be a terrible thing, or that the world is dangerous. You know, there's a lot that's really beautiful about a small child, and you still have that. That's the amazing, wonderful thing. When I get a little discouraged with this work, I get inspired by the spark of humanity, of life that reemerges and grows in people that have been really hurt, have been damaged by their religion. But there's still this life force, and that can be nurtured, and that can be those coping skills can be developed even more to where you can do things in a healthy, intentional way. Any comments at this stage? I don't want to just be running on endlessly, but any reactions to what I'm saying?
I like that you said it's mental violence.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossing of boundaries, right? I mean, you can think about all the ways that that's happened, and we'll get into some boundary issues with Marie tomorrow. And for one thing, there's no privacy, right? There's absolutely no privacy in religion. God is just like in your head all the time and judging, and then your life is supposed to be an open book to everybody else as well. And you're supposed to do all this confessing, and you just do not have ownership of your body. We'll talk about that, but also your own mind. You know, you can't just write private thoughts in a diary. God's reading it. So it's hard to develop a sense of self, of who you are, that's separate from all this exposure. And you're also supposed to be empty, right? You're not supposed to really have a self, because you're supposed to be an empty channel so that God can use you. And everything that good that you do is because God's working through you.
The governing body relied heavily on monitoring. Always, we were to monitor each other. If we saw the slightest deviation, we were to run to the elders. So it was other people always watching you. too,
Yeah.
not just God.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses are really big on that.
Very big.
But there are also things like accountability circles, accountability groups in churches where you're supposed to get together and confess to each other how much you masturbated. You know, everything you do is everybody else's business. So, and there's a lot of blame and judgment, obviously, because you're not going to get into accountability groups and talk about the things you're proud of, right? The good things that you like about yourself, like you just did with your buddy. So one of the big important things that we want to achieve and get started on this weekend, and what I'd like you to keep on thinking about, is compassion for yourself, right? You've been told that you should be compassionate towards others, but what about compassion for yourself? Conceptually, what you've actually been through can help you have compassion. And that's why with the assignment for writing your story, the suggestion was to write about yourself in the third person, because you're used to having a little more compassion for somebody else, even if it's like a friend or somebody else who's suffered. You know, you can talk about what they've been through instead of blaming them, and have compassion for them and know that they did the best they could given the circumstances. And so now we want to be able to do that for ourselves, you know, to think about what you've been through and then what you did to cope with that. So I'm going to cover some of this conversation, and then I think the storytelling is next, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we're going to break up into groups and tell our stories. And what I want you to do when you do that is you can talk in the third person, actually, if you want to, or you can talk about yourself, either way. But to explain what you feel like you've been through, and then also the things that you did to cope and survive, okay? Because you're alive now. You made it through. You have a lot of strengths even now. Even though you feel like you have a lot of problems, you also have strengths. So to include in your story what part of that was you coping and surviving. How did you do that? And congratulations for doing that. Okay? All right. So I think we'll talk about the paradigm shift later. Right now, let's just talk about the childhood religious indoctrination.